Welcome back to another deep dive, fellow philosophers.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Today's topic, well, it's one that I think we can all relate to on some level.
Oh, I think so, yeah.
Weakness of will.
The human condition.
Exactly. And, you shared this fascinating entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this very subject.
It's a really good one. I think it lays out a lot of the, kind of key arguments and problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And so our mission today is to unpack this whole notion of, why do we sometimes not do what we know we should?
Right, right. The shoulds, the could, and the would or the wouldn't.
Yeah. And we'll be exploring some of the classic examples, different philosophical perspectives, so hopefully this deep dive will give you an even deeper understanding of this very human experience.
I think it's fascinating precisely because it just seems so counter to the way we think of ourselves as rational agents. This idea that we can judge that one course of action is best, all things considered,
Mm,
and then just kind of intentionally opt for another.
right.
That's the real kind of paradox.
Yeah, and the entry kicks off with these three scenarios.
Yeah.
First you've got Julie choosing that tempting Paris vacation over the, more fiscally sound option of Peoria.
Right.
And then there's Jimmy reaching for the chocolate mousse instead of, the virtuous Wheaties.
The healthy option.
The healthy option, yeah. And, as the entry points out, these first two examples kind of highlight that our better judgment, it's not always like a simple calculation.
Right, right. It's not just about one thing. It's a complex kind of weighing of various values.
Exactly. And so, while Julie might know that Peoria is cheaper, that allure of Parisian culture, that might factor into her overall assessment of what's better.
Right, exactly. And for Jimmy, the immediate gratification might outweigh the kind of long-term health goals.
Exactly. But then you get to this third example,
Yeah.
Yosef. He does F instead of E, even though he believes that E is the better course of action overall.
That's the one, right. That's the one that just really makes you stop.
Right. Why would someone knowingly and freely choose what they believe is the worst option?
It's almost like it's a glitch in the system of how we think people work, you know?
Right. Like, it just doesn't compute.
It doesn't compute. And I think what that points to is that we have this very deep intuitive sense that there should be a strong connection
Right.
between our reasoned judgments about what's best and then our actions.
Yeah.
And when Joseph does that, it seems to sever that link.
Right.
And that's what makes it so philosophically puzzling.
And almost makes you wonder about the sincerity or like how deep that belief in E actually is.
Right. Like, how much did he really believe it if he just went ahead and did the other thing?
Exactly. And, this whole discussion surrounding weakness of will, I mean, this isn't just about everyday choices.
I hope it's not. It gets at some very fundamental philosophical issues.
Right.
The nature of rationality itself.
Exactly.
What does it mean to be a rational agent?
If you're consciously acting against your judgment.
Right. And then, what is the connection between belief and action?
Right.
Is it as straightforward
Yeah.
as we often assume?
Exactly.
And then just, what even are these evaluative judgments? Where do they come from? What do they mean?
Exactly.
So it really opens up this huge, rich vein of inquiry.
Yeah. And it touches on not just like personal decision making,
Right.
but ethics and moral philosophy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's dive deeper into this, this special character of judgments.
Right.
That the entry emphasizes about what's better overall, as opposed to, say, judging which argument is better or something like
Look,
that.
right. I think what's interesting here is that these judgments about what's better, all things considered, they seem to carry this kind of normative force.
Right.
Like, there's a built-in expectation of action that other types of judgments maybe don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I judge that, a logical fallacy just totally undermines an argument, but I still find myself swayed by it anyway, that's weird.
Right.
But it doesn't feel like a fundamental breakdown in my rational agency in the same way as if I judge that, I should do A and I do B instead.
Right.
It's like that judgment about what's better is somehow tied to the question of what I ought to do.
It's like it's got this action component baked in.
Yeah, it's not just sitting there as a thought. It's somehow connected to what I should do.
Exactly, yeah. And so, this whole surprise we have with Joseph, it really underscores this, like, implicit link we expect between our evaluations and our actions.
Right, we're surprised because there's this expectation.
Exactly. And of course, the philosophical term for acting against your better judgment
Right.
is weakness of will or akrasia.
The Greeks had a word for it.
They always did. And, the entry points out that even as far back as Socrates, there was this denial that this phenomenon was even possible.
Yeah, Socrates had a very particular view about this.
So what was his reasoning on this like seemingly counterintuitive claim?
Well, Socrates, famously in the Protagoras, he argued that no one who either knows or believes that there is another possible course of action, better than the one he is following, will ever continue on his present course.
Wow.
So no one would knowingly choose the worse option,
So
essentially.
he's saying it's impossible.
He's saying it's impossible, and his reasoning really stemmed from this idea that all human beings desire what they perceive to be good.
Right. We're all striving for the good.
Right, striving for the good. So if we genuinely know or believe that something is better for us, then this fundamental desire for the good should lead us to choose that thing.
Right.
So any apparent weakness of will for Socrates had to be a case of ignorance.
So not a failure of will, but just not knowing what was truly good.
Exactly, right.
Interesting. And then moving forward in philosophical history, you have R.M. Hare,
Yeah, a very influential figure in ethics.
who also argued against the possibility of weakness of will.
Yeah. And he picks up on this theme in a way that our evaluations are really linked to action.
Right, right. So how did his argument unfold?
Well, Hare basically said that if you genuinely judge that you ought to perform a certain action, then you will perform that action, assuming, of course, you're able to.
Right, you're not physically restrained or something.
Right.
Right.
And his argument is really rooted in his whole view of what evaluative judgments are.
Right.
He thought their primary role is to guide conduct.
So they're not just thoughts. They're telling you what to do.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And he called them, he said they answered the practical question, what shall I do?
Right.
And the only real answer to that question,
Hmm.
for him, is a first-person imperative.
So let me do this.
Let me do this, yeah.
Right.
And here's the kicker. Hare said that sincerely assenting to such a command means acting on it.
Oh, wow. So just saying to yourself, let me do this, is already doing it.
Well, not quite doing it, but it's like, if you genuinely believe it, then the action should follow.
Right. So if I say, let me get up from this extremely comfortable chair and start writing,
Yeah.
but I remain seated, then I didn't really mean it.
You didn't fully assent to that command.
I see, I see.
That's his position.
Wow, that's pretty strong.
Yeah. He's basically saying that your actions are the truest indicator of your moral principles.
Wow. Okay, so how did Hare deal with, these apparent instances of weakness of will, where it feels like we are doing something against what we know is best?
Right.
Like, staying in that comfy chair.
Yeah, the comfy chair problem.
Yeah.
He offered two main explanations. The first is the idea of inability.
Okay.
So he suggested that in some cases, the agent might be psychologically incapable of resisting their desires, even if they intellectually know what they should do.
So, like, if you're overcome by emotion.
Exactly, like, Medea in the grip of her rage.
Right.
She might know she shouldn't kill her children, but she's just overwhelmed.
Right. It's not a choice at that point.
Right, right. And then his second explanation was this idea of what he called inverted commas.
Inverted commas.
Yeah. It's like when someone says, I really ought to do A, but they do B, they might just be referencing what others believe, not what they themselves genuinely believe.
Oh, so it's almost like they're quoting someone else's judgment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, well, society says I should do this, but they don't really buy into it themselves.
Right, right,
So it's not a real genuine judgment.
right. But, as the entry points out, these explanations don't really cover all the cases
Yeah, there are some tricky ones.
that intuitively strike us as weakness of will. Like, take J.L. Austin's classic counterexample.
Right. The ice cream.
The ice cream,
Yeah.
where someone calmly and deliberately chooses to have that extra slice, knowing full well that it's not the best idea.
Right. No one's forcing them. They just go for it.
Exactly. And there's no, emotional breakdown. It's
Right.
just, yeah, I know I shouldn't, but
But I want it.
yeah.
And this really challenges Hare's view
Hmm.
because it shows that weakness of will doesn't have to be this big internal struggle.
Right.
Sometimes it's just calmly choosing what you know is worse.
And it seems very plausible that you could believe that something is worse and still choose it.
Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're not buying Hare's denial of weakness of will, what are the alternatives?
Right.
And the entry talks about this idea of extreme externalism.
Yeah.
What does that view look like?
Well, Hare kind of set up this dilemma. He said, either you accept his view, this internalism where your judgments lead to action, or you have to embrace this extreme externalism.
Okay.
which says that your judgments have no special connection to action.
So it's like your judgment about what's best is no different from any other belief.
Exactly, yeah. So it's like believing this object is heavy or, the sky is blue. It's just information.
So if I judge that exercise is good for me, but I don't care about being healthy, that judgment won't make me exercise.
Right. It's like, well, that's interesting, but I'm going to stay on the couch.
Exactly. But, as the entry points out, this extreme externalism doesn't explain why we find weakness of will puzzling.
Right. It kind of takes away the mystery.
It does.
Because if there's no link between judgment and action, then Joseph's choice is no weirder than Julie choosing Paris or Jimmy choosing the moose.
Right.
But we intuitively feel that those are different.
They are different.
Yeah. We think that acting against your better judgment is somehow special.
It feels wrong.
Yeah, feels wrong.
And it also seems like extreme externalism undermines the whole idea of practical reasoning.
Right. What's the point of thinking about what's best if it has no impact on what you do?
Exactly.
It makes the whole process seem pointless.
Right.
So what we need is some kind of middle ground.
Right. Something that captures both the connection between judgment and action and also the reality that we sometimes mess up.
Right, that we're not perfect rational agents all the time.
Right. And that brings us to Donald Davidson.
Davidson. A big name in philosophy of action.
Who tried to create this framework that could account for weakness of will.
Yeah, he wanted to show that it's possible, but still irrational.
Okay.
And he gave this very famous definition of what he called incontinent action.
Okay.
Which is when an agent intentionally does B, while believing they could do A, and judging that, all things considered, A is better than B.
So it's like, it's better, but you do the other thing anyway.
Exactly. And he realized that people tend to deny this is even possible.
Right.
And he even laid out these two principles, P1 and P2, that seem to rule it out.
Okay, remind us what those were.
So P1 was this idea that if you desire something more, you'll do it more.
Okay, so if I want the cake more than the salad, I'll eat the cake.
Right. And then P2 said that if you judge something as better, you'll desire it more.
So if I judge the salad as healthier, I'll want the salad more.
Exactly. But Davidson pointed out that these two principles together seem to imply that you'd never do something you judge to be worse.
Right, because if I judge the salad as better, I'll want it more, and then I'll eat it.
Exactly.
So how did Davidson get around this?
Well, his key move was to make a distinction between different types of judgments.
Okay.
He said that are all things considered judgments, which are the ones involved in weakness of will, they have a different logical form
Okay.
than just straight up judgments.
So like, this is better, period.
Right. And he introduced this term, prima facie judgments.
Oh, I remember that from ethics class.
Yeah. It means like at first glance or on the face of it.
Okay.
So a prima facie judgment is like, given this particular reason, A is better than B.
Okay, so it's like, this vacation is cheaper, so it's better in that respect.
Exactly. But then you have all-out judgments, which are just A is better than B, full stop.
Okay, so the prima facie judgment is like weighing one factor.
Yeah, it's like a partial judgment.
And the all-out judgment is the final verdict.
Exactly. And Davidson said that are all things considered judgments? They're actually more like really comprehensive prima facie judgments.
Okay, so they take everything into account, but they're still conditional.
Right. It's like, in light of all these reasons, A seems better.
But not necessarily. A is definitely better.
Right. And he said that making this all things considered judgment doesn't force you to make the all-out judgment.
So you can recognize that one option is better overall, but not fully commit to it.
Yeah, and then act on a weaker desire for the other option.
It's like gathering all the evidence that points to one suspect, but then arresting a different one.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So for Davidson, this isn't a logical contradiction, but it is irrational.
Right, because you're violating what he called the principle of continence.
Which is
Basically, do what you judge is best based on all the reasons.
Okay, so weakness of will is possible, but it's a failure to be fully rational. That's a clever solution. But the entry says that some philosophers weren't convinced.
Yeah, it's a tricky problem, and Davidson's solution has its own problems.
So what were some of the criticisms?
Well, one big criticism was that Davidson only explained how to act against a conditional judgment, not an unconditional one.
Right, that all things considered versus all-out distinction.
Exactly. Like, take Bratman's example of Sam, who explicitly says, abstaining from wine is best, period.
But then drinks anyway.
Right. Davidson would have to say that Sam only believes abstaining is better, all things considered, not absolutely better.
Right.
But Bratman argued that we can have those absolute beliefs and still act against them.
Right. It feels like we can.
So Davidson's solution might not capture the full reality of weakness of will.
I see. So the debate continues.
It does, yeah.
And after Davidson, the focus shifted to whether we can act against our unconditional judgments.
Right. And if so, is it ever rational to do that?
Right.
And you have these different camps. Some people want to keep a strong link between evaluation and action, even if it makes it harder to explain weakness of will.
So they're like hardcore internalists.
Yeah, they're like, our judgments must matter.
Right.
And then you have others who are more externalists who say, well, there are all sorts of things that influence our actions, not just our judgments.
So they're more open to weakness of will?
Yeah, but then it's harder to explain why we find it so puzzling.
Right. It kind of normalizes it.
Yeah.
And then there's this other interesting perspective.
Yeah.
This idea that maybe weakness of will isn't always irrational.
Right. The idea that maybe sometimes it's the right thing to do, even if it goes against your judgment.
So how could you argue for that?
Well, the main argument is that our better judgment can be wrong.
Right. It's just a belief. And beliefs can be mistaken.
Exactly. And they can be based on incomplete information or even biases.
So sometimes acting against your better judgment might actually be the more rational thing to do.
Right, if your judgment is flawed.
The entry gives the example of Huckleberry Finn,
Yeah, good old Huck Finn.
who judges that he should turn in Jim.
Right, because that's what society tells him.
But his refusal to do so out of his friendship and compassion for Jim is actually the morally right thing to do.
Exactly. So Huck's better judgment was actually wrong.
Because it didn't take into account his relationship with Jim.
Right, and his weakness of will was a form of moral strength.
Wow.
And there's another example, Emily, who's thinking of quitting her PhD.
Yeah.
She might think she should persevere, but if she's really unhappy, maybe quitting is actually better for her well-being.
So even if it goes against her stated judgment.
Right. The point is that our judgments aren't infallible.
Right. They can be outweighed by other reasons.
And sometimes acting against them can be the right thing to do.
That's a really interesting perspective. But the entry also raises this counter-argument.
Yeah.
Even if the outcome is good, ignoring your own judgment is still a problem.
Right. Because rationality isn't just about outcomes, it's also about process.
So if you habitually ignore your own conclusions, that's a sign of flawed reasoning.
Exactly. Even if you get lucky sometimes.
Right. Now, the discussion takes another turn when it introduces Richard Holton's view,
Yeah, Holton's an interesting thinker.
who says that weakness of will isn't about acting against your better judgment at the time.
Right. He says it's about failing to stick to your prior intentions.
So it's not about judgment versus desire in the moment.
It's about intention yesterday versus action today.
Okay, that's a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, and he's careful to say that not every intention failure is weakness of will.
Right, like if something prevents you from doing what you intended.
Exactly. He emphasizes that the key is whether it was reasonable to abandon the intention.
Okay.
And he introduces this idea of resolutions, which are intentions specifically designed to resist temptation.
So like, I'm going to resist that second slice of cake.
Exactly. And for Holton, weakness of will is failing to act on those resolutions.
So it's about breaking a promise to yourself.
Yeah, essentially.
And Alison McIntyre takes this idea further.
Right.
She shows that breaking a resolution due to the very thing it was meant to resist is always irrational.
Yeah, it's like a failure of self-management.
But she also says it might not always be completely irrational.
Right. Like if the resolution itself was stupid.
Like if you resolved to never drink water again.
Right. Breaking that resolution wouldn't be so bad.
And she distinguishes between acratic and non-acratic weakness of will.
Right. Acratic is when you still think the resolution was good.
Even though you break it.
Right.
And non-acratic is when you rationalize breaking it.
Yeah, like, well, that resolution wasn't so important anyway.
And she thinks acratic weakness of will might be better.
Yeah, because at least you're still recognizing what you initially thought was best.
It's amazing how much philosophical ground we've covered.
It's a really rich topic.
From denying weakness of will to debating its rationality.
Even redefining it.
And the entry goes on to talk about some recent developments.
Yeah.
Starting with this concept of epistemic acrasia.
Right. It's like the weakness of will of belief.
Okay, explain that.
So it's when you believe something, but you also believe that the evidence doesn't support it.
So it's like saying, I know it's not raining, but I still believe it is.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's like my beliefs are in conflict.
Is that even possible?
Some philosophers say it's not.
Because we don't have control over our beliefs like we do over our actions.
Right. You can't just choose to believe something. Your beliefs are supposed to be based on evidence.
Right. But there are counter-arguments,
There are.
like in philosophy itself, where there's a lot of disagreement.
Right. You might be drawn to one view, even if you know the arguments aren't conclusive.
And there's this idea of higher-order evidence.
Right. Evidence about your own judgment.
So it's like knowing you're biased.
Exactly. And some philosophers say that this can lead to rational epistemic acrasia.
So it's like, I believe this, but I also know I shouldn't trust my judgment.
Yeah, like the Detective Sam example. Who knows he's less reliable when he's tired?
Right, right. But whether that's truly rational is still debated.
It is, yeah. Some people think higher order evidence should always override your initial beliefs.
Okay. And finally, the entry talks about addiction.
Yeah, tough one.
Is addiction just extreme weakness of will?
Some people think so.
Because it involves acting against your judgment and breaking resolutions.
Right. But others say it's different.
Because of the cravings, the habits, the triggers.
Right. And the fact that people with addictions often try really hard to quit.
So it's not just giving in to a momentary temptation.
Right. And there are questions about whether addiction is always rationally criticizable.
Right, because it's so complex.
It is.
Wow, this has been a really mind-bending exploration of weakness of will.
That's a fascinating concept.
From Socrates to epistemic acrasia and addiction.
And it all stems from this simple idea that we don't always do what we think we should.
Right, and that seemingly simple idea leads to all these philosophical questions.
About rationality, about belief, about action.
And about what it means to be human.
Exactly.
So for you, as a philosopher, what are some of the biggest implications of this whole discussion?
Well, I think it really challenges our view of what a rational agent is.
Okay.
If weakness of will can be rational sometimes, then maybe we're not these perfectly consistent, unified selves that we think we are.
Right.
And maybe our actions are driven by a more complex interplay of values and reasons than we realize.
And that has implications for ethics.
Absolutely. It raises questions about moral responsibility.
Right.
Like if someone does something wrong, but against their better judgment, how much are they to blame?
These are big questions.
They are.
Well, this has been a truly illuminating deep dive into the puzzle of weakness of will.
It's a puzzle that's been around for centuries.
And as you mentioned, the entry has a great bibliography for anyone who wants to go deeper.
Yeah, there's so much great work on this topic.
So for our fellow philosophers out there, what parts of this discussion resonated with you?
What new questions does it raise?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Keep the conversation going.
And join us again next time for another deep dive into the world of philosophy.